Thank you for allowing me to present remotely. Of course, in retrospect, I think the university's decision may have been a good one. Otherwise, I'd be spending another 14 days in a hotel for a while. I'm going to take you on a bit of a trip into the past. In 2020, Marty Campbell and I were asked, based on our experience as marine invasion people who work on biosecurity, if we undertake a review of the Cots control efforts between 2012 and 2019. And really, this was an attempt to take a look at how well the program had changed, what activities had occurred, and what opportunities existed. Now, let's see if there we are. The independent review had a suite of terms of reference, which many of you are undoubtedly familiar. These 6 activities, really the first 5, are the ones that we'll concentrate on today. It is a summary of the manual Cots control initiatives, again, since 2012 to 2019, with explicit focus on the location, scale, and timing, the assessment of key strengths and weaknesses of the program, and that really is on the basis of reviews and criticisms that occurred in the published literature, the validity of surveillance and control data, the in-depth scientific analysis of available data, really reflecting on the activities that had occurred previously, and then a review of the current site prioritization and decision support processes. Now, most of these would have been talked about during this morning, so we'll just quickly get into the meat of what we found. And I'm very happy to hear, especially the last 3 talks, how well those new programs and initiatives have been taken on board and implemented, leading to some good successes. The summary of the manual Cots control initiatives implemented since 2012 really looked across that window as 3 key areas, 3 key timings, 2012 to 2013 to 2014-15, 15-16 to 17-18, and 18-19. And these periods will be used for the rest of the review in terms of what we undertook. Those periods also resulted in refinements of objectives, location, scales, and timing of effort driven by changes in strategy, and specifically the best available scientific evidence. And you can appreciate that there were many drivers that were being pulled through that period, especially the 2015-16 to 2017-18 window. And then most recently, the first 6 months of the new program. So specifically, we noted that the program objectives shifted from what was essentially a reactionary tactical response to Cots outbreaks, almost entirely focused on economic values, to a more strategic response, which specifically focused on core environmental values, the protection of coral cover, but also delivering to those economic and social benefits. As we move through the windows of years, we can see that the locations, in terms of the proportion of reef visits that were prioritized by GRUMPA, increased through time to 100% in the last window. And more importantly, the proportion of culling activities increased significantly in those priority sites, even earlier on. So the focus and the activity, the development of priority sites, gave us a strong incentive for how the implementation of the control program worked. More importantly, and the colors represent individual vessels, we can see that the scale in terms of the number of voyages increased during each of those windows, but with changes, we saw a retraction and a reinvigoration. With this last window actually increasing to reaching about 90% of voyages going to priority sites. The geographic shifts, we saw an expansion of the program to 140 reefs across 10 degrees of latitude. And mind you, this is as of 2019. I know that there has been a continuing expansion of the program that we've seen since then. A local scale shift from outbreak locations on reefs to whole reef approaches, and then culling targets shifting from initially a CPUE threshold of 0.1 Cots per minute at culling sites and increasing with the derivation of the Babcock et al. Thresholds and continuing those culling targets as informing how we make decisions on site. The timing, early on, the decision to cull, there was no explicit decision-making when to initiate a cull in the first two windows, but now with the implementation of the new program and the decision support system, we see that there is explicit decision-making, and while we can argue whether that threshold is appropriate or not, it does provide us with a conservative approach that makes sure or ensures that we are culling in those locations where Cots are most likely to be. And of course, site revisitation. Initially, there was no explicit requirement, no targets established. However, as we've moved through time, we've seen an increase in the priority activity with the most recent revisitation frequency targeting about 2 weeks, approximately every 12 days. Now, the second requirement was the assessment of key strengths and weaknesses. And of course, a key concern of various stakeholders has been whether the manual control management actions actually were efficient at what they did and how appropriate they were during the current cycle. Those critical reviews and scientific assessments highlighted key strengths and weaknesses in the Cots control program. What we wanted to do is ensure that we were talking the same language. So we were tasked with the post-Commonwealth investment in 2012 through to 2019, and we undertook an assessment of scientific literature, collated gray literature reviews, and information that was provided from key stakeholders to begin the process of assessing that. We found 19 relevant articles, but only 7 examined relevant data sets during those windows in time. 4 during the first time period, 2 in the second, and 1 specifically looking at the 2018-2019 window. If we look at the key strengths and weaknesses that were identified in those reviews, they were basically broken into strategies, operational logistics and targets, and data collection, curation, and transparency. And as you can see, with each of these, there was an enhancement in terms of addressing those issues through time. In the first window, we had a significant number that were either underperforming or were meeting the needs or beginning to meet the needs, I should say. Whereas in the last window, we can see that the majority of them have been met in terms of the activities and the new program. These two, the voyage planning and site revisitation frequency and the surveillance and intelligence, were those 2 elements that had yet to be implemented in 2019. Hence the, yeah, we're sort of making it, but there's a question mark associated with them. The validity of surveillance and control data to assess the effectiveness and support decision-making models and prioritization activities, we found that they were sufficient or appropriate in terms of activity. A critical shift from that tactical approach to the broader scale activity actually brought refinements to what data is collected, how that data was collected and reported, as well as how that data was used, both in terms of the larger scale strategic planning, as well as the on-site decision to cull. So the Cots control program in its current expanded control program phase, so that's the one that was implemented in the 2018-19 window, we found to be a robust evidence-based framework that provides clear mechanisms for adaptive improvements. The persistent criticism of the Cots control program from 2012 to 2019 was the lack of control reefs to assess the effect of Cots culling relative to other stressors to hard coral cover. What we found was the IPM strategy and the prioritization of reefs based on the connectivity meant that leaving some reefs uncontrolled was likely to compromise the integrity of the program. That is, if we did this, we were unlikely to have succeeded in terms of that broad-scale strategic effort. So we agreed with the approach that the current program in its formation was unsustainable if we included some of those control elements. Instead, the assessment of the underlying connectivity model becomes critical in terms of those assumptions. specifically larval PLDs or pelagic larval dispersal distances for different coral species and for Cots is critical. And the self-recruiting coral and Cots populations on individual reefs is an input that is required to make sure that the connectivity model is appropriately cast. Additionally, reef health assessment for a wider network of reefs is required to make sure that that connectivity model incorporates the broader scale activity. The cross-validation of hard coral cover estimates based on risks and manto surveys being brought into the model is critical as well. And then, as you can see, the reef health differentiation between types of coral, the maintenance mode, site hard coral cover baselines for recovery, absolutely critical in terms of identifying whether we're achieving the outcome of coral recovery. Cot size class detectability is a needful element to ensure that what we are measuring is accurate and we know what the biases are. And then understanding the Cots replenishment following a culling activity to aid determination of optimal revisitation. Right now, the frequency is an estimate, and I'm sure that many of the previous three workers at the minimum would be able to tell us and inform us what they believe are the appropriate elements. The fourth one, the in-depth scientific analysis of available data, was originally for us to take that data and to assess it. However, it was immediately countermanded by the fact that there were two NEST reviews undertaken by Westcott and Fletcher et al. In both 2018 and 2019. The terms of reference changed to reflect the fact that these were comprehensive reviews and they wanted us to undertake a critical assessment to determine if the methods that were employed and the activities supported the findings of reduced Cots density at priority reefs, as well as the reduction in average size of Cots at priority reefs. We certainly found that there was support for both the reduction of Cots densities and in fact the reduction of different size classes, with the larger size classes being reduced immediately, and a reduction in the average size of Cots at those control locations. The element of import is the reproducibility or the reproduction ability of those populations. And we found that the arguments that were put forward and the analysis that had occurred was sufficient to support the benefit of the program. And then lastly, the review of the current site prioritization and decision support processes. Again, I remind you that this review was undertaken up to 2019, and at that point, 3 decision trees had been developed: the manual decision support, the decision support system, and the voyage planning, which were not implemented, the last 2 not implemented until 2019. So really the first one, the manual decision support, was able to be assessed, and we found that it was appropriate, recognizing that reefs are the appropriate management unit and that prioritized targeting of key ecological and economic assets were critical in achieving the outcomes of the program. So thank you very much for allowing me to deliver this to you from Western Australia. Hopefully you have an excellent rest of the afternoon, and I'm happy to answer questions.